The water was cold. January cold, the kind that settles into your bones before you even know it's happening. James Marshall knelt down beside the mill race at Coloma, along the South Fork of the American River, and looked at something he almost dismissed, a few flakes, pale yellow against the dark gravel. He picked one up, held it to the thin winter light. It didn't break when he bit it. He put it in his hat, kept working. The sawmill had to be finished. John Sutter needed it finished. Marshall went back to supervising his crew, the Mormons who'd stayed behind after the war with Mexico, the native workers, the few other men who'd signed on for the job in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. But he kept looking at that hat. That evening, January 24th, 1848, he walked into Sutter's fort alone and asked to speak with John Sutter in private. He pulled out what he'd found wrapped in a rag. Sutter tested it every way he knew how. He got out his encyclopedia and looked up gold. He weighed it. He dropped acid on it. It was gold. Sutter told Marshall to keep quiet. He had plans, big ones, for an agricultural empire in California. Gold would ruin everything. Thousands of people would pour in. They'd tear up the land. And he was right about all of that. But secrets in California in 1848 were hard to keep. Within a week, a few of the Mormon workers knew. Within a month, people in the surrounding settlements had heard whispers. By spring, a newspaper publisher named Sam Brannan walked through the streets of San Francisco, holding a bottle of gold dust above his head and shouting that gold had been found on the American River. Brannan wasn't being altruistic. He'd already bought up all the mining supplies in the region. Every pan, every pickaxe, every shovel. He sold equipment that cost him 20 cents for $15 and made a fortune before a single serious miner reached the foothills. But that spring, it was still mostly a California story. The rest of the country knew almost nothing. That changed on December 5th, 1848, when President James K. Polk stood before Congress and confirmed what the rumors had been saying for months. There really was gold in California, remarkable quantities of it. He cited reports from military officers who had been on the ground, men whose credibility couldn't easily be questioned. The country stopped what it was doing. In New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in the small farming towns of Ohio and Pennsylvania and Virginia, people read those words and felt something shift. Something they couldn't quite name. A door opening. The possibility that everything they knew about their life and its limits might not be as fixed as they'd thought. That feeling spread fast.
Hi guys, I'm interrupting the video just to ask you that if you like it, can you please click like and subscribe? Thank you.
Within weeks of Polk's message, the newspapers were full of it. Letters from men already in California describing nuggets the size of walnuts, streams where gold sat loose in the gravel, hills that hadn't even been touched yet. Some of those letters were exaggerated. Some were outright lies. Some were perfectly accurate and still sounded impossible. The effect was the same either way. People started planning. The men who left first in the early weeks of 1849 were the ones who could make decisions quickly. Some had savings. Some borrowed against their farms or their businesses. Some simply walked away from everything they had and figured they'd deal with the consequences later. The word that stuck, the one that defined them, was Argonaut, like Jason and the sailors who chased the Golden Fleece. Except these men were real, and they were traveling to California, and most of them had no real idea what they were walking into. The journey overland in 1849 deserves more time than it usually gets in the gold rush story, because it was its own extraordinary event, separate from the gold itself. The wagon trains that left from Missouri in the spring of 1849 were assembling from across the Midwest and the East. Independence, Missouri, was one of the main jumping-off points, and in April and May of that year, the town was overwhelmed. Wagon makers couldn't fill orders fast enough. Blacksmiths worked through the night shoeing horses and oxen and repairing equipment. Supply merchants ran short of everything. The streets were jammed with men who'd come from Ohio and Indiana and Pennsylvania and New York. who'd sold or mortgaged whatever they had back home and showed up here with their families or their friends or completely alone, ready to start walking west. They organized themselves into companies for the trail because everyone understood that individuals traveling alone were vulnerable. A company of 20 or 30 wagons could help each other when wagons broke down, could provide some security against the threat of attack, could share knowledge and supplies through the inevitable difficult stretches. The companies drew up bylaws and elected captains before they'd gone 10 miles, because that's what Americans did. They organized, they voted, they followed procedures, The procedures started unraveling pretty quickly once the reality of the trail set in. The first section across the Kansas and Nebraska prairie was genuinely beautiful. The grass was green and the wildflowers were out, and the weather in May and June was often mild. The oxen were fresh and moved steadily. Men who'd been nervous about the journey started to relax a little. How hard could it be? The land stretched out ahead of them, flat and open and seemingly endless, and the sky was enormous above it, bigger than any sky they'd seen before. They made good mileage in those first weeks, 15 or 20 miles a day on good days. Then they hit the Platte River and followed it west into what's now Nebraska, and the reality started to change. The trail was crowded. Tens of thousands of people were making this crossing in the same spring, and the evidence of their passage was everywhere. Dead cattle by the side of the road, killed by the strain of the journey or by disease. Discarded furniture and equipment, the remains of campfires, and most alarmingly, graves. Cholera had come to the trail in 1849, moving west with the emigrants almost as fast as they could travel. It was in the water, in the Platte River that everyone drank from, in the cooking pots that weren't cleaned well enough. A man could be feeling fine at noon and dead by midnight, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The doctors in the wagon trains had no effective treatment because no one yet understood that cholera was waterborne. They prescribed everything, and it all failed equally. The graves multiplied. Wooden markers at first, then just stones, then sometimes nothing at all. Trail diaries from 1849 describe stretches of the trail where you could see fresh graves on both sides of the road for miles, and the knowledge that any of the people around you might be next, that you yourself might be next, settled into the consciousness of every company in a way that permanently changed the mood of the journey. Men who'd started out with jokes and high spirits went quiet. The evening gatherings around the fire, which had been social occasions in the early weeks, became shorter and more subdued. People were tired and worried, and the distances were longer than they'd imagined, and the mountains were still ahead. The Rockies were crossed at South Pass in Wyoming, a broad and gentle crossing that was easier than the name implied. But then came the choice that every company had to make somewhere around the present-day state of Nevada. How much water to carry, how much weight to cut, which route to take across the alkali desert. Men who'd hauled their most prized possessions from Missouri were now looking at them with calculating eyes, asking which of these things I not live without. The answer was usually less than they'd thought. Stoves went first, too heavy for the tired animals, then trunks of clothing, then books. One diary from the period describes coming across a pile of books by the side of the trail, hundreds of them, Bibles and novels and school books and ledgers, abandoned by some company ahead that had decided weight mattered more than literacy. The narrator stopped his wagon and looked at them for a while, then drove on.
The Humboldt River, which they followed across northern Nevada, was a cruel piece of geography. The river existed, which meant water, which meant life, but the water was increasingly alkaline as you went west, bad for the animals, and the land around it was dry scrub that offered almost nothing for the exhausted cattle and oxen. The Humboldt Sink, where the river just disappeared into the desert floor, was the psychological low point of the whole journey for most companies. From there, it was a long, dry push, 40 to 50 miles in some routes, with no water before you reach the springs at the base of the Sierra Nevada. Men drove their wagons through that stretch at night to avoid the worst of the heat, walking in the dark, leading the animals by feel, watching the sky for the mountains that would signal the end of the desert. When they finally came into sight, pale and enormous against the dawn sky, people wept. And then there was still the Sierra itself to cross. The passes through the Sierra Nevada, Donner Pass most famously after the disaster of 1846-47, were high and steep and covered in snow well into June. Companies that reached the base of the mountains in late summer had to make a calculation about whether they could get through before the first snows of fall. The mountains didn't care about their calculations. They imposed their own timeline. Men who made it through the Sierra in September and October came down the western slopes into California's Central Valley looking like they'd been through something, which of course they had. Gaunt from months of poor diet, worn through their boots, eyes with a quality that people noticed, something that came from having been pushed to a limit and come through it. They'd crossed a continent. They'd survived something that killed a significant percentage of the people who attempted it. And they'd done it not because they were extraordinary, but because they'd made a decision and followed through on it past every point where they might reasonably have stopped. That quality, the sheer stubbornness of it, was not something the gold rush gave them. It was something they brought to the gold rush, something that was already there in the character of people who'd been homesteading the Midwest and keeping farms going through hard winters and raising families in isolation. They already knew how to endure. California just gave them a reason to find out how much they could endure. There were 3 ways to get there from the East Coast.
The first was around Cape Horn at the bottom of South America. Ships left from New York and Boston and Baltimore, some of them barely seaworthy, crammed with passengers who paid whatever the captains asked because the captains knew they had no choice. The trip was 4 to 8 months depending on the vessel and the winds. Passengers lived below deck in conditions that would be described today as inhumane. They ate salt pork and hardtack, slept in hammocks stacked 3 deep, and spent the worst stretches in Cape Horn storms that could last for weeks. Violent cold seas that tilted the ships sideways and sent luggage and people sliding across wet decks. Men who'd never been farther from home than the next county found themselves in the middle of the Southern Ocean, praying they'd see morning. Some of them didn't. Those who made it around the Horn stopped at Valparaiso in Chile or Callao in Peru to resupply, sometimes spent weeks waiting for favorable winds, and eventually turned north up the Pacific coast toward California. When San Francisco Bay finally came into view, after all those months at sea, men who'd thought they were tough cried without being embarrassed about it. The second route was through Panama. You sailed to the Caribbean side of the isthmus, crossed overland through the jungle to the Pacific coast, and caught another ship north to San Francisco. Faster than Cape Horn on paper. But Panama in 1849 was a place where cholera and yellow fever killed men within days of arrival. The crossing itself, through dense jungle on mule paths or in dugout canoes, could take 2 weeks or more. And when you reached the Pacific side, you might wait weeks or months for a ship with space living in makeshift camps on the beach while the disease picked through the crowds. Many men who'd survived the Atlantic crossing and the jungle died waiting for a ship on the other side of Panama that never came in time. The third route was overland, the one most people picture when they think about going west. The wagon trains, the Oregon Trail and its branches, the plains of Nebraska and Kansas, the crossing of the Rockies, the Nevada desert. It took roughly 5 months if everything went well, and everything rarely went entirely well. Most of the men who went overland in 1849 didn't really know what they were getting into. Some had crossed the Appalachians and thought that was the kind of challenge they'd be facing. It wasn't even close. The scale of the American West is something that has to be experienced to be understood. Day after day of flat grassland where the horizon looks the same as it did yesterday and will look the same tomorrow. Then the land starts rising, and the work gets harder and the oxen start showing the strain. The passes through the Rockies were cold and treacherous. The Nevada desert on the other side was the worst stretch of the whole journey, dry and brutal, where animals died and wagons had to be abandoned, because the teams couldn't pull them anymore. Men who'd carried everything they owned out of Missouri left pianos and furniture and crates of supplies by the side of the trail, because the alternative was losing the oxen and then losing everything. Those who made it through Nevada still had the Sierra Nevada to cross, the last real obstacle, and the Sierra didn't care how far you'd already come. There was a moment, somewhere in that crossing, when men who'd left Ohio in April and were now looking up at a granite wall in September with the summer nearly gone, when they had to make a decision with very little information and very high stakes. Keep going, and hope they could get through before the snow closed the passes. Or turn back. And turning back meant losing everything, all those months, all that sacrifice, all the money borrowed, and the goodbyes said, and the promises made. Most of them kept going. The ones who got through remembered the moment they came out on the California side, the way the mountains fell away, and the valleys opened up below them, green and gold in the late-season light. The air smelled different, warmer, like they'd crossed into another world, which in a sense they had. California in 1849 was not a state. It wasn't even well-governed territory. Mexico had ceded it to the United States only months before in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War. But the formal machinery of American governance hadn't arrived yet. There were no courts, no sheriffs, no real legal system to speak of. What there was people, tens of thousands of them arriving faster than any infrastructure could possibly accommodate.
San Francisco, which had been a small village called Yerba Buena just 2 years before, was becoming something else entirely. Ships arrived in the bay and often just stayed there. The sailors abandoned them to go mine for gold, and the captains couldn't stop them because the captains often abandoned their own ships too. At one point, there were hundreds of ships sitting empty in San Francisco Bay, ghost vessels slowly rotting, their crews somewhere in the Sierra Nevada foothills trying to get rich. Some of those ships were eventually dragged ashore and used as building material or as the foundations of warehouses and businesses. The city grew on top of them. The town itself was a chaos of tents and rough wooden buildings that went up fast and burned down regularly. Fire was a constant danger in a city where everything was made of wood and every establishment seemed to have a dozen candles and an open hearth going. San Francisco burned and rebuilt itself multiple times in those early years, sometimes with such speed that merchants who'd lost everything were back in business within days. There was money to be made in the city itself, and plenty of people figured that out early. Selling to miners was more reliable than mining. But for the men who came for gold, the city was just a waypoint. They passed through it, bought what they could afford, and headed into the foothills. The Mother Lode country, the long diagonal band of gold-bearing rock and river that ran through the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada, from Mariposa in the south to Nevada City and beyond in the north. The rivers that drained those slopes, the American, the Yuba, the Feather, the Stanislaus, were where the gold was. The work of placer mining, the kind that defined the early gold rush, was both simpler and harder than most newcomers expected. Simpler because the basic technique wasn't complicated. You scooped gravel and sand from the riverbed into a pan, submerged it, and swirled the water in a circular motion. Gold, being heavier than everything else, settled to the bottom while the gravel and sand washed over the rim. You did this over and over, slowly working down through the material in the pan until you either found something or found nothing. Most of the time, you found nothing. Harder because you were doing this in cold water, sometimes standing knee-deep in a river running off snowmelt for 10 or 12 hours a day. Your back ached. Your hands went numb and then cracked and bled. The sun at that elevation could be fierce even when the water was freezing, and men who hadn't thought to bring hats ended up with faces burned raw within days. The diet in the camps was poor: salt pork and beans and sourdough bread, maybe some dried fruit if you could afford it, coffee that was mostly grounds. Scurvy became a problem for men who went long enough without fresh vegetables. Dysentery moved through the camps with frightening regularity, carried in the water, spread through the close quarters of tents and rough cabins where 20 men might sleep in a space meant for 5. And yet, in those first months, before the creeks were thoroughly picked over and before the real machinery of industrial mining arrived, there was gold to be found, real gold. A man with a pan and some luck and the willingness to work from before dawn until after dark could find more in a single week than he'd make in a year of farming back home. There were stories, real ones, of men pulling $20 a day, $100 a day, amounts that seemed like fiction to anyone who'd lived on a laborer's wage of $1 a day. Those stories spread back east and brought more men, and more, and more. By the end of 1849, roughly 90,000 people had arrived in California. The year before, fewer than 1,000 non-native people had lived in the Sacramento Valley. The scale of that change is hard to process even now. Entire communities were emptied out. Farmers walked off their land. Lawyers abandoned their practices. Preachers left their congregations. A newspaper editor in New York named Horace Greeley wrote about the madness he was observing. Men of good sense and steady character who seemed to lose the ability to think clearly the moment gold was mentioned. He wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't there. He didn't see what they were running toward, or in some cases what they were running away from. Because for some men, California wasn't really about gold. It was about a second chance, a fresh start in a place where nobody knew what you'd been or what you'd failed at, where the past didn't follow you and the future seemed, however briefly, genuinely open. A man named John Banks left his farm in Indiana in the spring of 1849. He was 41 years old, had a wife and several children, and had been trying to make the farm work for years without much success. He kept a diary on the trail west, and reading it a century and a half later, you can feel how much the trip meant to him beyond just the possibility of gold. He wrote about the land he was crossing, described it carefully, paid attention to the plants and animals. He wrote about the men he met on the trail, the conversations at night around the fire. He was observing something he'd never had the chance to observe before. The world was bigger than he'd known. Banks made it to California. He didn't strike it rich. He worked the diggings for a season, saved a modest amount, and eventually made his way back home. But his diary suggests he didn't entirely regret the journey. He'd seen something, done something, that had its own value. Most of the 49ers were like Banks. Not the men who hit it big, not the disasters either, though there were plenty of those. Just ordinary people who took a long shot on something extraordinary and ended up with a complicated story to tell. The camps where miners worked and lived were unlike anything that had existed in America before. They sprang up along every creek and river that showed any sign of gold, often within days of the first discovery. A dozen tents became 100, then a few hundred. Rough buildings went up, saloons and general stores and fandango halls and assay offices. All of them built fast and built cheap because nobody expected to be there for long. The names they gave these places had a quality to them that you don't find in the more settled parts of the country. Rough and Ready, You Bet, Gouge Eye, Red Dog, Fiddletown, Shirt Tail, Canyon. The names suggested men who weren't trying to impress anyone, who'd left behind the pretense that had governed their lives back east and were living for the first time or the last without it. The social rules in the camps were different too. Back home, a man's reputation was everything. Here, your reputation arrived with you and could be shed just as quickly. Men used aliases without shame. Past crimes, past debts, past failures stayed in the past if you wanted them to. What mattered in the camps was how you worked, whether you were honest in your dealings with other miners, and whether you could hold up under conditions that tested everyone.
There was a rough justice in the camps, and it was genuinely rough. With no courts and no law enforcement to speak of, miners formed their own committees and made their own rules. Claims jumping, stealing a man's established mining claim, was treated as one of the most serious offences and could result in flogging, banishment, or worse. Actual theft was dealt with quickly and harshly. A man caught stealing provisions from another miner's tent might be whipped, branded, have his ears cropped, or be hanged, depending on the mood of the assembled miners and the nature of the crime. This frontier justice was faster than anything a court would have provided, and it was often more violent. It was also not always just in any recognizable sense. The same committees that executed genuine criminals could turn on someone for reasons that had more to do with who he was than what he'd done. The Chinese miners, who began arriving in significant numbers by 1850 and eventually numbered in the tens of thousands, faced a particular version of this. They were industrious workers who often took up claims that other miners had abandoned as exhausted and found ways to make them productive again. They lived together in their own communities, maintained their own customs, and largely kept to themselves, and they were targeted systematically. California's foreign miners' tax of 1850 and a second version passed in 1852, specifically aimed at the Chinese, forced them to pay a monthly fee that white miners didn't have to pay. They were driven off their claims by mobs. They were subjected to violence that almost never resulted in prosecution, because California law at the time didn't allow Chinese people to testify against white men in court. The gold rush was a transformative moment in American history, and like most transformative moments in American history, it was not equally transformative for everyone. The California that emerged from it was built on the labor of people who didn't always share in its benefits, and on the destruction of people who had been there long before any of them arrived. The native Californians, who numbered somewhere around 150,000 before 1848, found themselves in the middle of a catastrophe. The miners and settlers who poured into the foothills didn't think much about who had been living there. They pushed native people off their traditional lands, destroyed the ecosystems those people depended on, and when native communities resisted, responded with violence that escalated into what historians have called, with increasing directness, genocide. The California state government paid bounties for native scalps. Vigilante groups and later state militia units killed native people and burned their villages. Within 20 years of the gold rush, the native population of California had fallen from 150,000 to roughly 30,000. The numbers tell the story plainly enough. The Mexican Californians, the Californios who had been promised property rights under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, found that promise was largely hollow. Their land grants, some of them going back generations, were challenged in American courts that operated by different rules and in a different language. The legal battles were expensive and slow, and many Californios lost their land not through outright seizure, but through the grinding process of proving ownership in a system designed for someone else. And yet the camps themselves had a democracy of misery that cut across some lines, even while reinforcing others. A wealthy merchant's son from Boston, working a claim alongside a German immigrant and a Chilean sailor, and a free black man from Virginia, none of them finding much gold, all of them eating the same bad food and sleeping in the same kind of tent. That kind of leveling happened too. Not as much as the mythology suggests, but it happened. The gold itself was where you found it, and it was not evenly distributed. The places, the free gold in the riverbeds and gravel bars, were richest at first and closest to the surface. The men who arrived early got the best of them. By 1850, many of the easily accessible surface deposits were worked out, and the miners who'd come late found themselves competing for ground that had already been picked over by 2 or 3 previous waves. The daily yields dropped. Men who'd been making $20 a day were now making $2 if they were lucky. The equipment evolved to keep up. The simple pan gave way to the rocker, a cradle-like device that could process more material per hour than a pan. Then came the long tom, a longer sluice that could handle even more. Then hydraulic mining, which used high-pressure water cannons to blast entire hillsides into slurry that ran through elaborate sluice systems. Hydraulic mining was spectacularly effective at moving earth and spectacularly destructive to everything downstream. The sediment from the hydraulic operations choked California's rivers, raised riverbeds by dozens of feet in some places, flooded farmland, and destroyed fishing. It was eventually banned by a federal court in 1884, in one of the first significant environmental rulings in American history, but by then the damage was enormous. The individual miner with his pan was being replaced by something else, by companies with capital and machinery, by wage labor. The dream of the independent prospector striking it rich was giving way to the reality of a man working for a mining company for a daily wage, which was better than no income, but nothing like what the original dream had promised. Most of the men who came for gold didn't find enough of it.
That's the part of the story that gets less attention than the successes. Maybe because it's less entertaining. Maybe because it challenges the narrative that hard work and determination are always enough. The 49ers who came with high hopes and went home with almost nothing. The men who spent their savings on the journey and on equipment and on supplies and on the endless expenses of camp life and ended up poorer than when they started. The men who stayed too long kept telling themselves one more season, one more creek, one more valley over the ridge, and woke up at 50 with a broken body and not much to show for it. There was a woman named Louise Clapp who lived in the mining camps along the Feather River in 1851 and 1852 with her doctor husband, and who wrote letters home to her sister in the East that were later published under the pen name Dame Shirley. Her letters are the most vivid account we have of what the camps were actually like from someone who observed them carefully and wrote well. She didn't romanticize. She described the mud and the bad weather and the gambling and the drinking and the violence. She also described the humanity of it, the men who were genuinely trying, who kept their humor under difficult conditions, who helped each other in ways that didn't fit the image of every miner as a solitary, selfish fortune seeker. She wrote about a miner named Ned, who was dying of scurvy in a tent in the rain, and how the other men in the camp took turns sitting with him. She wrote about Christmas in the camps, the improvised celebrations, the homesickness that surfaced at the holidays, and that usually got drowned in whiskey because drowning it seemed easier than feeling it. She wrote about what it was like to be one of very few women in a community of thousands of men, the strange respect that came with that rarity, the loneliness of it too. Her letters are worth reading not just for the history, but for the writing. She paid attention. The men who struck it rich, really rich, were fewer than the mythology suggests, but they existed. There were men who pulled thousands of dollars from a single claim in a single season. There were the famous lucky strikes, the moments that were so improbably dramatic they sound like they were invented. A man named Chana found a 50-pound nugget at his camp on the middle fork of the American River. It was worth something like $5,000, which was more than most working men made in 5 years. But the biggest fortunes from the gold rush were not made by miners. They were made by the men who sold things to miners. Sam Brannan, who we've already met, became California's first millionaire from his store at Sutter's Mill. Levi Strauss came from New York with bolts of tent canvas and ended up making work pants reinforced with copper rivets that miners found more durable than anything else available. The riveted denim pants are still with us. John Studebaker worked in Placerville making wheelbarrows for miners, saved his money, and went back to Indiana to help turn the family business into one of the most successful wagon and later automobile manufacturers in American history. Philip Armour, who would build a meatpacking empire, made his first money supplying meat to California miners. Mark Hopkins, who would become one of the Central Pacific Railroad's Big Four, sold hardware in Sacramento. The infrastructure of California, the roads and supply chains and financial systems and eventually the railroad, was built in response to the needs of the gold rush, and the men who built that infrastructure often did better than the men who'd come for the gold itself. San Francisco grew from a few hundred people in 1848 to 30,000 by 1850 and kept growing. It became a real city with banks and newspapers and theaters and churches and schools. Sacramento, which had been nothing, became the main supply depot for the goldfields and grew accordingly. Stockton, Marysville, Sonora, Nevada City, Placerville, all of them grew from nothing into functioning towns with their own institutions. The California that emerged from the gold rush was unlike any other American state. It had been settled not in the usual slow progression of farmers and families pushing gradually westward, but all at once, in a flood, by people from everywhere. By 1850, California had residents who'd come from every state in the Union, from Mexico and Chile and Peru, from China and Australia, from England and France and Germany and Ireland, from the Sandwich Islands, from everywhere reachable by sea. It was cosmopolitan in a way that most of the rest of America was not, and it retained that quality. The state entered the Union in September 1850, skipping the usual territorial phase, and did so as a free state, which had enormous consequences for the sectional balance of power that was already pushing the country toward the Civil War. California's admission as a free state required the Compromise of 1850, which, among other things, strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act and set conditions that postponed the war but couldn't prevent it. The rush itself peaked somewhere around 1852. That was the year the total gold extracted from California hit its highest point, something over $80 million worth by the prices of the time. After that, the yields declined. Not immediately or all at once, but steadily. The surface placers were largely exhausted. The hydraulic operations were increasingly capital-intensive. The easy pickings were gone.
Men who'd come with everything started to leave with less. The first wave of departures was made up of the ones who'd always said they'd stay just one season. But as the years went on, more men who'd intended to stay longer gave up and went home. Some went home successful. A lot more went home having roughly broken even, which felt like failure even when it wasn't. And some went home broken, having lost years of their lives and whatever savings they'd had, and sometimes their health as well, to a dream that hadn't worked out. The ones who stayed in California often did so because they had nothing to go back to. They'd burned their bridges, or they'd married California women, or they'd built something, a business or a farm, that gave them a reason to stay. Or they'd simply lost the energy for the trip back and told themselves they'd leave next year, and eventually stopped telling themselves that. The 1860s brought the Comstock lode in Nevada, silver this time, and drew a new wave of miners away from California. The same patterns repeated, the same stories, the same mixture of hope and disappointment, and occasional real success. Men who'd been in California since '49 packed up and headed east over the Sierra, which they'd crossed coming the other way more than a decade before, toward new diggings in the same spirit they'd first gone west. The restlessness of the gold rush era didn't end with California. But California was different afterward. What had been a lightly populated backwater, remarkable mainly for its climate and its distance from everything, had become a state with 250,000 people, a functioning economy, political influence in Washington, and a mythology that would grow in the telling for generations. The myth of the 49er, the brave individual who risked everything on a long shot, and won or lost by his own efforts, became a central piece of the American self-image, even for people whose families had nothing to do with California in 1849. It was a myth that elided the violence and the dispossession, and the failures and the dead and the displaced. But myths serve purposes, and the purpose this one served was to tell a story about possibility, about what America was, or could be, or wanted to be. A place where a man could start over, where luck and work and nerve could change everything. There's a kind of truth in that, and a kind of lie, and both are still with us. The men who came for gold and found nothing left the most invisible record. Their names appear in ship manifests and trail diaries and county records and then disappear. They went home and were absorbed back into the ordinary life they'd left, which closed over them the way water closes over a stone. A few of them talked about California in their old age, told their grandchildren about crossing the plains or rounding the Horn, but the stories got fuzzy with time, and the grandchildren usually half believed them anyway. The men who found gold and kept it built things, houses and businesses and families. You can sometimes trace them in the records, see the arc of their lives take a different shape after California. A farmer who came back from the diggings with enough to buy better land. A mechanic who saved enough to open a shop. Men whose lives were genuinely changed for the better, quietly and lastingly by what they found. And the men who stayed in California, who built the state, are everywhere in its history. The names of early settlers on streets and counties and schools, the families that became prominent, the institutions that trace their origin to those early chaotic years. California is, in a real sense, the gold rush's most lasting legacy. The Sierra Nevada foothills today are green and beautiful in spring, brown and golden in late summer, with the kind of landscape that rewards a slow drive on a two-lane road. The rivers run clear and cold. In some of them, patient prospectors still pan for gold on weekends and occasionally find something. Not enough to live on, but something. A few flakes in the bottom of a pan. The same thing James Marshall found in January 1848, before anyone knew what it meant. The old mining towns have a particular quality to them now. Placerville, which used to be called Hangtown, Nevada City, which still has its Victorian buildings and its sense of something older than most California towns, Columbia, which is preserved as a state historic park. Its main street still surfaced with wooden plank sidewalks, its storefronts painted the colors they were 160 years ago. You can walk through those towns and feel the ghost of what they were, the energy and the chaos and the desperate hope of it. The diggings themselves are mostly gone back to nature. The hydraulic scars on some hillsides are still visible, great pale gouges in the earth that grass and brush have only partly reclaimed. The tailings of the hard rock mines pile up outside abandoned shafts. The ground has been so thoroughly worked over in some places that the landscape itself tells the story, if you know how to read it. Gold is still there in California. It never ran out. It just became too expensive to extract relative to its value, which rose dramatically over the course of the 20th century and has risen further since. At modern prices, some of the old workings are being looked at again. There are small operations in the foothills that extract gold using more careful methods than the hydraulic blasting that wrecked the rivers. The business of it has changed completely, but the gold itself hasn't. There's something about gold, the physical fact of it, that the story keeps coming back to. It doesn't corrode, it doesn't tarnish. It stays the same for thousands of years in the ground and looks the same when it comes out as it did when it went in. The flakes and nuggets that miners washed out of California rivers in 1849 were formed in geological processes 300 million years ago, worked into the quartz veins of the Sierra by pressures and temperatures that dwarf anything in human experience. They lay in those mountains and those rivers through the rise and fall of every civilization before ours. Native Californians knew they were there and didn't attach to them the value the miners did. Value is a human thing, and the value placed on gold in 1848 was itself a story about what people believed gold could do, what it meant, what it was worth. What it was worth in 1849 was a different life. That's what men were really paying for. Not gold itself, not the metal, but what it promised. The possibility that everything could change, that the fixed world of who you were and what you had and what you could expect could suddenly be unfixed. That the riverbed contained not just ore, but options. Some of them found what they were looking for. Most didn't, but they looked. In the spring of 1849, a man named Alonzo Delano left Illinois with a wagon and a team of oxen, and the kind of optimism that is only available to people who don't yet know what's coming. He kept a journal on the trail west, careful and observant, and later wrote a book about his experience that was one of the first accounts of the gold rush to reach a wide audience. In it, he described a moment somewhere on the Humboldt River in Nevada, in the middle of the driest stretch of the whole journey, when one of his oxen died. He wrote about standing over the animal for a while, not dramatic about it, just noting it. Then he described the decision to keep going, to redistribute the load, to make do with one fewer ox. And there's something in the plainness of how he tells that story that gets at something true about the whole enterprise. You lost things. You adjusted. You kept going. Not because you were heroic, necessarily, but because turning back was also a choice with costs, and going forward was what you'd committed to. He made it to California. He mined for a season with modest results. He eventually settled there, became a journalist, wrote more books. He became a Californian, which was a new thing to be. The gold rush made a lot of new things. It made California a state and a place with a particular identity. It made the Overland Trail a proven route and helped prepare the ground for the transcontinental railroad that would follow. It made fortunes, some that lasted and some that didn't. It emptied towns in the East and Midwest and filled them back in with people who'd gone west and come home changed. It killed people, many of them, through disease and accident and violence and the simple grinding difficulty of life at the edge of the known world. It made myths about America that we're still living inside of. The mythology of the self-made man, the lucky break, the fresh start, the raw country that rewards those brave enough to try. Those ideas were in American culture before 1848, but the gold rush amplified them enormously, gave them a set of images and stories that stuck. The miner with his pan, the wagon train on the open plain, the boom town with its wild energy, the strike that changed everything overnight. Those images became templates, and the templates got applied to later booms in other places. Silver in Nevada, oil in Pennsylvania and Texas, land in Oklahoma and Kansas, each new rush following some version of the same pattern. The crowd gathering. The hope. The reality that was always more complicated than the hope. And maybe that's the thing about the gold rush that stays with you if you sit with it long enough. Not the gold, not even the people, as interesting as they are, but the feeling of that moment before you know how something turns out, when the promise is still intact and the reality hasn't arrived yet to complicate it. January 24th, 1848. James Marshall kneeling by a cold river in the Sierra Nevada foothills, something glinting in the gravel. The world, for a moment, perfectly suspended between what it was and what it was about to become. He picked it up, held it to the light. It didn't break when he bit it. And then everything changed. All of it. The country, the continent, the story Americans told about themselves and what was possible, all of it changed, in ways both beautiful and brutal, from that one cold morning by a river in the mountains of California. The gold is still there in the hills and in the rivers and in the museums and in the stories. It never really goes away. It just waits to be found again, to mean something again to whoever finds it. Patient, permanent, unchanged by the centuries. Just like it was that winter morning, when the world was still quiet and the light was just coming up over the mountains, and no one yet knew what was about to begin. Sacramento in 1849 and 1850 was a particular kind of madness.
It sat at the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers, at the edge of the Sierra Nevada foothills, perfectly positioned as the supply point for the gold fields. Everything that went into the mountains passed through Sacramento, and everything that came out of them passed through Sacramento on the way back. The city grew accordingly, explosively, without plan or precedent. In the fall of 1849, when the first hard rains came, Sacramento flooded. The town sat on the floodplain, and the rivers rose, and the streets became channels of brown water, and the buildings that hadn't been built on raised platforms went under. Merchants watched their stock float away. Men paddled through the main streets in canoes. Typhoid and dysentery spread through the waterlogged camps. The city rebuilt, then flooded again, then rebuilt again. Sacramento was flooded multiple times in those early years, and each time the response was the same: dry out, rebuild, get back to work, because there was money to be made, and the miners in the hills needed what Sacramento could provide. The prices in Sacramento and in the mining camps were a kind of economic hallucination. 100 pounds of flour that cost $1.50 in Missouri cost $50 in Sacramento in 1849. Eggs were $1 apiece. A pair of boots could run $100. A haircut was $1, which was a day's wage for a laborer back east. Doctors charged an ounce of gold for a basic consultation, which was $16, which was more than a week's wages for a skilled tradesman in New York. Those prices made people who weren't miners quite comfortable. The woman who ran a boarding house and charged $40 a week for bed and 2 meals could do very well indeed. The barber who charged $1 per cut and did 100 cuts a week was earning more than most lawyers made in a year. The laundryman who charged $8 a dozen to wash and press shirts, which in San Francisco was the going rate, had a business that couldn't keep up with demand. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but consistent with the documented prices, of a miner who discovered that his shirt was beyond washing and decided to simply buy a new one. The new shirt cost $10. The miner paid without flinching because he'd pulled $30 of gold that morning, and $10 felt like a reasonable price for not having to be embarrassed. This was the arithmetic of the gold rush economy. When the expected daily take from mining was $10 or $20 or $30, prices that would seem impossible back home became acceptable. The problem was that the expected daily take kept dropping. The creeks that had yielded $20 a day in 1848 yielded $3 in 1850, and nothing you could depend on in 1852. But the prices in Sacramento didn't drop as fast, and the men who were now making $3 a day found that $10 shirts and $50 bags of flour were no longer affordable. This was one of the less discussed mechanisms by which the gold rush transferred wealth from miners to merchants. The merchants locked in their prices when gold was easy and maintained them as gold got harder to find. The miners who'd accepted those prices when they could afford them found themselves in a kind of economic trap. They had to keep mining to pay the bills that the high prices had normalized, but the mining wasn't producing enough to keep up. Some men responded by giving up on mining and going into business themselves. The trail from miner to merchant was well worn. A man who'd spent a year digging with modest results and who had some capital left might put it into a store or a saloon or a freighting operation, betting that the service economy around the mines was steadier than the mines themselves. He was usually right. The service economy was steadier. Not all of those ventures succeeded, but the ones that did provided a more reliable income than placer mining after the first good years. The saloons of the mining camps deserved their own moment. They were the social centers of the camps, the places where men gathered at the end of long days to drink and gamble and argue and occasionally fight. They ranged from absolute dives, canvas structures with a plank bar and a barrel of bad whiskey, to surprisingly elaborate establishments in the larger towns, with mahogany bars and mirrors and chandeliers imported at enormous expense from San Francisco. The whiskey served in the less reputable establishments was frequently adulterated. Frontier liquor merchants cut their product with water and added tobacco and red pepper to give it color and heat. Men who drank it got drunk fast and got sick regularly, and the hangover whiskey they ordered the next morning to steady themselves was more of the same. Alcoholism was a significant problem in the mining camps, perhaps unsurprisingly given the conditions under which men were living and the absence of most of the social structures that might otherwise have constrained their drinking. Gambling went along with the drinking. Monte, a card game brought north from Mexico, was the most popular gambling game in the California camps, partly because it was easy to learn and partly because the California dealers who dealt it were famously skilled and honest, in contrast to some of their Anglo counterparts. Faro was popular too. Men gambled away their week's earnings in an evening, shrugged, and went back to the diggings the next day determined to do better. Some of them did do better. Some of them just lost more. The women of the gold rush are harder to find in the standard histories, partly because there were fewer of them, and partly because their stories were less likely to be written down and preserved. but they were there, and what they did matters. In the first wave of 49ers, women were rare. Most of the companies that came overland or by sea were composed entirely or almost entirely of men. The journey was considered too dangerous and too rough for women, an assumption that the women who did make it tended to disprove pretty decisively. But the social norms of 1849 meant that most men left their wives and families behind, intending to come back in a year with gold. Most didn't come back in a year. Some didn't come back at all. The women who stayed behind in Ohio and Indiana and Pennsylvania and Virginia managed the households, the farms, the businesses, the children on reduced incomes, waiting for letters that came slowly and money that came even more slowly. Their experience of the gold rush was the experience of absence, of managing alone, of not knowing. Some of those women were eventually reunited with their husbands. Some got letters saying things had gone badly and weren't going to improve. Some stopped getting letters at all. The women who went to California were a different matter. Some went with their husbands, part of family migrations that included children and grandmothers and the full household. Some went independently, which took a particular kind of nerve in 1849 or 1850. The ones who went found that their scarcity gave them a strange kind of power in a place full of men who hadn't seen a woman in months. In some mining camps, men would pay $1 just to see a woman's dress hanging on a line because it reminded them of home. The economy of gender in the California camps was as distorted as every other economy there. Women who ran boarding houses or restaurants or laundries in the mining camps often did exceptionally well financially. The domestic skills that were taken for granted back east, cooking decent food, doing laundry, sewing and mending, were scarce and valuable in a camp full of men who couldn't or wouldn't do those things for themselves. A woman who could cook a recognizable meal and charge accordingly could make more in a week than her husband could mine. Mary Jane Capples came to California with her husband in the early 1850s and left a memoir that survived. She wrote about arriving in the camps, about establishing a boarding house, about the management of a household under conditions that had no precedent in her experience. She wrote with matter-of-fact competence about things that would have defeated many people, about dealing with supply shortages and difficult customers and the constant threat of fire. She made it work. Her husband's mining efforts were less consistently successful.
There were also women who came to California for the same reason the men did, because they needed a fresh start, because they had nothing to keep them where they were, because the gold rush represented possibility in ways that went beyond the gold itself. The entertainment industry of the mining camps, if you can call it that, was staffed by women who'd made their way west under varying degrees of choice. The fandango halls and gambling saloons employed women as dancers and dealers and companions, and the relationships between those women and the camps were complicated and individual in ways that the shorthand terms of the era don't capture well. Lola Montez was famous before she arrived in California and managed to remain famous there. She'd been a dancer and courtesan in Europe, had been the mistress of the King of Bavaria, and arrived in California in 1851 with a reputation that preceded her and a talent for performance that she put to immediate use in San Francisco and then in the mining camps. Her spider dance, in which she pretended to shake spiders out of her skirt, was either scandalous or delightful depending on who you asked, and she managed to fill theaters wherever she went. She eventually settled in Grass Valley, had a bear cub as a pet, and became a colorful fixture in the northern mother lode until she returned east in the late 1850s. Lola Montez was one of a kind, but she was also representative of a category. Women who understood that the gold rush had loosened the usual social rules and who moved through the resulting freedom with purpose. The children of the gold rush are almost invisible in the histories, which is its own commentary on whose stories were thought worth keeping. But children were present, especially in the family migrations that became more common after 1850 as California began to stabilize. They went to school in one-room schoolhouses when schools existed, and taught themselves from whatever books were available when they didn't. They worked because everyone worked in the camps, and children were not exempt. They grew up around the casual violence and heavy drinking and rough language of the mining world, and were shaped by it in ways their parents probably hadn't intended. Some of those children became the founders of California's institutions in the latter half of the 19th century. They were the first California-born generation of a certain kind, the first to grow up in a place that was still defining what it was, and they carried that sense of indeterminate possibility with them into adulthood. The Chinese experience in California during the gold rush was shaped by contradictions so extreme they're almost impossible to hold in mind at once. The Chinese came in large numbers beginning around 1850 and 1851, mostly from Guangdong province in southern China, mostly young men who'd heard of the Gold Mountain, Gamsan in Cantonese, from relatives or labor brokers, or the ships that connected China to California's ports. Many came under the credit ticket system, their passage paid by companies or brokers who would be repaid from their future earnings, a system that created a kind of indentured obligation, but also made the journey possible for men who couldn't otherwise have afforded it. They worked in ways that impressed even people who were simultaneously trying to dispossess them. Chinese miners would take a claim that had been worked over by previous miners and work it again, more carefully, more systematically, extracting gold from material that other miners had dismissed as played out. They built elaborate water diversion systems to direct water where they needed it. They worked in groups that could pool labor and knowledge in ways that individual prospectors couldn't match. They were also extraordinarily vulnerable. They couldn't testify in court against white men, which meant that virtually any crime against them was effectively legal. Mining company records and contemporary diaries document robberies, assaults, and murders of Chinese miners that resulted in no prosecutions because the witnesses were Chinese and their testimony was inadmissible. The foreign miners' tax, first passed in 1850 and then revised in 1852 specifically to drive up the burden on Chinese miners while exempting most Europeans, was collected by force when necessary. Men who couldn't or wouldn't pay had their equipment confiscated. The collectors were sometimes abusive in ways that had nothing to do with the tax itself. Petty humiliations imposed on men who couldn't protect themselves legally. Chinese communities in the mining towns maintained themselves through sheer internal cohesion. They had their own organizations, their own merchants who served the community's needs, their own systems of mutual support. The Tong organizations that provided this community structure were sometimes portrayed in the Anglo press as criminal conspiracies because the press was reflecting the prejudices of its readers, but their primary function was to help Chinese men navigate a hostile environment where official institutions offered them no protection. Many Chinese miners who accumulated any significant gold sent it home to China because they intended to return eventually, and because California's legal environment made secure investment then nearly impossible. The Gold Mountain had been real for some of them in terms of actual gold found, but the California that was supposed to follow from that was increasingly hostile to their presence, and they knew it. The discrimination that Chinese Californians faced in the gold rush era was the beginning of a longer story in American history that would continue through the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and beyond. California's treatment of its Chinese residents in the 1850s was an early and explicit statement of who was welcome in the new American West and on what terms. The black miners in California were a smaller group, but their situation illuminated different aspects of the same fundamental questions about who America was for. Some were free black men from northern states who'd come west on the same ships as everyone else, hoping the gold rush represented a genuinely new start. Others were formerly enslaved men who'd used the disruption of the gold rush era to purchase their freedom or simply to create distance from the systems that had held them. A few came to California as the enslaved companions of southern masters, which created legal situations that the California courts, operating under a free state constitution, were reluctant to fully sort out. A man named Alvin Coffey came to California from Missouri in 1849 with a white man who owned him. Coffey worked the diggings and gave his earnings to his master, as he was legally required to do. He managed to keep some back. Over time, through mining and other work, he accumulated enough to purchase his freedom from his master for $1,500 and then buy his wife's freedom and his children's freedom as well. He stayed in California, farmed, and eventually became a prosperous landowner. His story is remarkable both for what he accomplished and for how clearly it shows what it cost. Black Californians faced legal discrimination in the state even after the gold rush period, including prohibitions on testifying against white men and exclusion from certain professions and public accommodations. But California also had a black community with its own institutions and press and political organizing almost from the beginning, because the gold rush had drawn people from everywhere, and among them were people who understood that the fight for equality in the new state needed to start immediately. The decline of the gold rush didn't happen all at once. It was a slow deflation, drawn out over years, that was sometimes hard to distinguish from just a bad season or a worked-out creek that might have a neighbor worth trying. By 1853, the placer deposits along the main rivers of the Mother Lode were largely exhausted, in the sense that they couldn't support the density of miners working them. A man with good technique working a promising spot might still find enough to live on. But the days of pulling a week's Eastern wages in an afternoon were over for most miners. The mathematical possibility that any given spot might make you rich was shrinking towards zero.
The miners responded in several ways. Some left. The ones who'd always said they'd go home after a year or two now had the excuse they needed. They packed what they had, sold what they couldn't carry, and started the long journey back. For many of them, the journey home was cheaper than the journey out had been, because the competition for ship passage going east was nothing like the crush going west. They arrived home changed, sometimes enriched, more often humbler about the possibilities of luck and hard work than when they'd left. The ones who stayed often shifted what they were doing. Mining itself was evolving. The gold that was left was harder to get at, buried in the quartz veins of the hillsides, rather than sitting loose in the riverbeds. Getting at it required hard rock mining, which meant drilling and blasting and tunneling, capital-intensive work that individuals couldn't do alone. Mining companies formed, sold shares, hired miners as wage workers. This was a fundamental transformation. The 49er had been, in his own imagination at least, a free agent. The man who worked for a mining company was a wage laborer, which was what he'd been or might have been back east, and which was not what he'd come to California to become. The romance of it was gone. What remained was work, hard work, which paid reasonably but not spectacularly, and which didn't carry the possibility of the great strike that had animated the whole enterprise. Some miners followed gold to new places. Nevada in the 1860s, Montana and Idaho in the same decade, the Black Hills of South Dakota in the 1870s, Alaska at the very end of the century. Each new rush drew some California 49ers who were still in the grip of the original dream and figured that this next place might be the one that finally paid off. A few of them found what they were looking for. Most didn't. But the dream persisted. The men who stayed in California and didn't mine turned to other things. California's agriculture was beginning, and land that the gold rush had attracted settlers to was now being farmed. The Great Central Valley, which stretched for 500 miles between the Sierra Nevada and the Coast Ranges, was the most productive agricultural land in North America, and people who'd come for gold and stayed for other reasons started to understand what they had. Wheat first, then vegetables, then fruit, and eventually the extraordinary diversity of crops that California produces today. The railroad came in 1869, which changed everything again. The Transcontinental Railroad, built in part by the Chinese workers whose labor was both essential and underpaid, tied California to the rest of the country in a way that the wagon trains and the sailing ships hadn't. Goods moved faster, people moved faster. The isolation that had made California so expensive and so chaotic in 1849 was reduced, though not eliminated. The prices in Sacramento settled toward something that resembled the rest of the country. San Francisco grew and grew. By 1870, it was the 10th largest city in the United States, which was astonishing for a place that 25 years earlier had been a village of maybe 800 people. It had banks and newspapers and theaters and an opera house. It had cable cars by 1873. It had a population that was genuinely cosmopolitan, with large Chinese and Irish and German communities and the remnants of the original Spanish-Mexican California families. It was not a comfortable city in all respects, especially not for its Chinese residents, but it was an alive city, a city that felt like the future was happening there. The transformation that the gold rush had worked on California was permanent and profound. The state that the gold rush made was the state that California remained, in its essential character, for generations. Diverse, restless, entrepreneurial, attached to the idea of possibility in ways that other states, with their longer and more settled histories, were not. California attracted dreamers because it had always been a place where dreams had an unusual relationship to reality, where some of them, against all probability, had actually come true. John Sutter, in whose sawmill the gold was first discovered, ended his life in poverty trying to get the United States government to compensate him for what the gold rush had done to him. His story is one of the most complete ironies of the whole episode. Sutter was a Swiss immigrant who'd arrived in California in 1839 and built a remarkable agricultural and trading empire in the Sacramento Valley centered on the fort that bore his name. He'd cultivated relationships with the Mexican authorities and with the native peoples of the region and had created something genuinely impressive, a functioning fiefdom in the wilderness, producing wheat and cattle and lumber, employing hundreds of people. Marshall found gold at Sutter's mill in January 1848, and Sutter's worst fears came true almost immediately. The workers abandoned their posts for the diggings. The crops went unharvested. The cattle wandered. The men who poured into California crossed his lands, ate his crops, killed his cattle, ignored his attempts to assert property rights, and generally treated everything he'd built as a resource to be consumed.
Sutter tried to maintain some control, tried to profit from the situation, but he was overwhelmed. The legal system that might have protected his property rights was overwhelmed too, or simply didn't exist yet in any meaningful sense. By 1852, Sutter was effectively bankrupt. The empire he'd built over a decade was gone. He spent the next decades in a different kind of quest, submitting claim after claim to the United States Congress, arguing that the government owed him compensation for the losses he'd suffered when his land was overrun by the gold rush that the government had encouraged. Congress took up his claims several times and declined to act on them each time, usually on technical grounds related to the status of his Mexican land grants. He died in 1880 in a Washington hotel room, still waiting for Congress to do something. He was 87 years old, had outlived his enemies and most of his champions, and had received nothing. His story is a cautionary tale about the relationship between discovery and reward, between the man who finds the thing and the forces that profit from it. Marshall, who first picked up those flakes of gold from the mill race, also died poor. He'd tried mining and tried lecturing about his discovery, and tried capitalizing on his fame in various ways, and none of it worked out. The man who started it all was last heard from trying to sell his autograph. The great beneficiaries of the gold rush were rarely the people who were on the scene at the beginning. They were the merchants, the bankers, the land speculators, the railroad builders, the men who understood that what the gold created was an economy, and that economies had more reliable returns than mining. James Lick came to California in 1847, before the gold rush. with a modest amount of capital and bought land in San Francisco at prices that seemed reasonable at the time. When the gold rush began and San Francisco exploded in size, Lick's land was worth more than he'd imagined possible. He never mined an ounce of gold. He eventually became the richest man in California through what he'd bought before anyone knew what was coming. The Huntington, Hopkins, Stanford, and Crocker families, the Big Four of the Central Pacific Railroad, got rich not from gold, but from understanding that the gold rush had created a captive market. California needed to be connected to the rest of the country, and whoever built and controlled that connection would be extraordinarily powerful. They built it. They extracted tolls on everything that moved in or out of California for decades. They became among the wealthiest men in American history. The 49ers who went home wealthy from actual mining were real but not typical. The ones who went home broke or nearly broke were more numerous, and the ones who stayed in California and found their fortune in something other than mining were perhaps the most consequential of all, because they built the state that those who came later would inherit. The winter of 1849 to 50 in the Sierra Nevada foothills was the first full winter many of the 49ers experienced in California, and it taught them things that nobody's letter home had prepared them for. The California winter is not what Easterners expected. The summers were dry and cold, the winters wet and surprisingly cold at elevation. The rains came in October or November and didn't stop for months. The creeks that had been gentle in the summer became swollen and violent, impossible to work in even if you could stand the cold. The camps that had been dusty and hot became bogs of mud that pulled at your boots with every step and found its way into every tent and cabin. Mining effectively stopped, and men who'd been earning even a modest daily take from the diggings now earned nothing, while the prices for food and supplies didn't drop correspondingly. They ate through whatever they'd saved, supplemented by game if they were lucky or skilled, and waited for spring. The boredom was its own torment. Men who'd been physically exhausted by mining now had nothing to do and too much time to think. The letters home, which had been excited and optimistic in the summer, turned more complicated. Men wrote honestly about what winter in the camps was like, about the mud and the cold and the illness and the gambling that filled the idle hours, because there wasn't much else to do. Gambling debts were a serious problem in the winter camps. A man who might have been careful with his money when he was actively earning became reckless when the days were long and empty, and the card tables at the saloon were the only entertainment available. Men gambled away their summer's earnings in a few weeks, and then had months more of winter to regret it. The camps also got violent in the winter. Not universally, not everywhere, but the combination of crowding and idleness and alcohol and frustration produced conflicts that the summer work had kept suppressed. There were fights and robberies and the occasional murder, and the miners' committees that served as law enforcement had to deal with them using the means at their disposal, which were blunt. A murder in a mining camp in the winter of 1849-50 might be adjudicated in an afternoon. The miners would assemble, hear testimony from witnesses, deliberate, and decide. The decisions were sometimes merciful and sometimes weren't, and there was no appeal. The man who was found guilty of murder in a miner's court was usually hanged within hours, not from cruelty, but from pragmatism. There was nowhere to hold a prisoner long term, and no one to guard him.
The camps that survived those first winters were the ones with enough of a community to keep people accountable to each other. The ones where men were known, where reputations mattered, where someone would speak up if the proceedings seemed unjust. In the anonymous chaos of the largest camps, where men from everywhere were pressed together with no common history, the courts of the miners could be more brutal. Dame Shirley, writing from the Feather River camps that winter, described the execution she witnessed with the precision of someone who was horrified but determined to see clearly. She was not sentimental about it. She described the condemned men and what they'd done and how they behaved at the end and what she felt watching it, which was complicated. She didn't look away. That refusal to look away is what makes her letters so valuable. The Gold Rush mythology, built in retrospect, tends to smooth over the violence and the suffering. The eyewitness accounts don't. Spring came eventually. It always does. The rain stopped, the rivers dropped back toward their banks. The sun returned to the foothills with its particular California warmth, dry and clear. The men who'd wintered in the camps came back out to the diggings looking thinner and in some cases more determined, and in others visibly worn. They'd made it through something. They weren't sure yet whether it had been worth it. Most of them kept going anyway. The environmental consequences of the gold rush were severe and long-lasting in ways that weren't fully understood for decades. The placer mining that characterized the early gold rush was relatively contained in its damage. Men working by hand in a section of river left the immediate area disturbed, but not permanently altered. The creek might run silty for a while and then clear. The banks might be dug up and then slowly revegetated. But as mining techniques scaled up, the damage scaled with them. The long toms and sluices that replaced the pan in 1850 and 1851 moved enormous quantities of gravel, much more than any individual could manage. Company operations employing dozens or hundreds of men could work through a section of river that would have taken an individual miner months. Then came hydraulic mining, and the damage became something else entirely. The technology was developed around 1853 by a man named Edward Mattison, who figured out that you could use the natural pressure of water brought downhill from reservoirs through pipes to blast the mining face with a concentrated jet. The hydraulic monitor, the nozzle that directed the water, could direct a stream powerful enough to knock a man down at 100 yards. Directed at a hillside full of gold-bearing gravel, it turned the whole face into slurry within minutes, slurry that ran into sluice systems that extracted the gold and sent the waste downstream. The efficiency was extraordinary. A hydraulic operation could process in a day what would have taken manual miners weeks. The gold came out. Everything else came out too. The rivers downstream from the hydraulic operations filled with sediment. The Yuba River, which drained some of the heaviest hydraulic mining areas in the northern Sierra, rose by dozens of feet in some places as the tailings built up. Towns on the Yuba's banks, including Marysville, found themselves increasingly at risk of flooding as the riverbed rose toward the tops of their levees. The farmlands of the Sacramento Valley, downstream from the Sierra, began filling with debris. Fields that had been productive were buried under feet of mining waste. The Sacramento River itself was affected, its channels shifting and shallowing in ways that threatened navigation. Farmers, who were now a significant economic and political force in California, fought back. The Sawyer decision of 1884, handed down by Federal Circuit Court Judge Lorenzo Sawyer, found that hydraulic mining as practiced constituted a public nuisance and prohibited the discharge of debris into the rivers. It was an extraordinary ruling for its era, one of the earliest significant environmental legal decisions in American history. The hydraulic mining companies fought the ruling hard. They argued that their operations were essential to California's economy, that the restrictions were unconstitutional takings of property, that the farming interests were being privileged over mining interests in ways that the law didn't support. They lost mostly. Some hydraulic mining continued under limited conditions with debris dams to contain the tailings, but the era of unrestrained hydraulic blasting was over. The landscapes that hydraulic mining had worked were left in a state that persists in places even today. The Malakoff Diggings in Nevada County, the largest hydraulic mine in California history, is now a state park, and what you see there is hundreds of acres of bare badlands where there used to be forest-covered hills. The shapes are almost geological in their scale, pinnacles and ravines of colorful earth carved by the water cannons and then frozen in place when the mining stopped. It's a strange and haunting landscape, beautiful in its way, and completely the result of human action. The rivers recovered slowly and incompletely. The Yuba and the American and the Feather are healthier today than they were in the 1870s and 1880s, but the valley they drain still shows evidence of what was deposited there. The salmon runs that had sustained native communities for millennia were devastated and never fully recovered. Fish ladders and modern conservation efforts have brought some improvement, but the rivers of the Sierra Nevada foothills today are not what they were before James Marshall looked into the mill race at Coloma. The newspapers played a role in the gold rush that is easy to underestimate from this distance. In 1848 and 1849, before the telegraph had fully connected the country, newspapers were how information traveled between regions. A paper printed in New York would be read in Cincinnati and Cleveland and Pittsburgh a week or two after it was printed, and its contents would be discussed at dinner tables and in taverns and in general stores for weeks after that. What the newspapers said about California in those months shaped how millions of Americans understood what was happening there. And what the newspapers said was largely extraordinary. Some of it was accurate, drawn from letters written by men on the scene and printed with or without editing. Some of it was speculation that had hardened into apparent fact through repetition. Some of it was deliberate fabrication by writers who knew what their readers wanted to hear and provided it. The stories about California that circulated in 1848 and early 1849 described a land of almost incomprehensible richness, where gold lay on the surface of the ground, where rivers ran with it, where a man who applied himself for a single season would return with enough to set up for life. That picture wasn't entirely wrong. For some men, in some places in those early months, it was true. The problem was that it became the baseline expectation, and most men arrived in California with that expectation already fixed in their minds, already spent against the future. When reality turned out to be $3 a day and cold water and bad food and mud, the gap between what they'd been told and what they found was crushing in a way that affected how they wrote home about their experience. Men who would have been perfectly satisfied with $3 a day under ordinary circumstances found it insufficient because they'd been led to expect 20. Their letters home reflected that disappointment, which in turn deflated some of the enthusiasm that had been building on the East Coast. But the newspapers were also slow to give up the gold rush story because it sold papers. Even as the yields were declining and the reality was becoming clearer, the stories of lucky strikes and nuggets the size of fists continued to appear, because readers didn't want to hear that the dream was fading, and because stories of men who'd succeeded were more entertaining than stories of men who hadn't, which was true then as it is now. The gold rush was, among other things, a story about the gap between how things are presented and how they actually are, between the image that gets created and circulated, shaped by the interests and desires of the people creating and circulating it, and the experience of the people on the ground who are living in the actual version. That gap is not unique to the gold rush, but it is particularly visible there because the distance between the image and the reality was so dramatic and so consequential. The relationship between the gold rush and California's native peoples deserves more than the brief mention it usually receives in popular histories. The native Californians in 1848 were already a diminished population compared to what they'd been before European contact. The Spanish missions had reshaped their world, often violently. Mexican ranchero culture had absorbed some native labor under systems that were often little better than servitude. But they were still there in significant numbers, living in ways that had adapted to the presence of outsiders while maintaining much of their traditional culture. The gold rush destroyed what remained of that world with a speed and thoroughness that has no parallel in California history. The problem was not simply that miners took native land, though they did. It was that the ecosystem on which native communities depended was transformed within years. The rivers that had provided salmon for thousands of years were muddied and blocked, and their banks dug up. The game animals that had supplemented the fish diet were hunted heavily by miners who needed meat. The oak groves that produced acorns, a staple food for many California native groups, were cut for firewood and building material. The wild plants that filled out the diet were trampled and dug up and displaced by the intensive activity of tens of thousands of people moving through the foothills. Native people who tried to protect their territory were met with violence that escalated quickly. A raid on a mining camp, or even the suspicion of one, could produce a punitive expedition that burned villages and killed everyone it found, regardless of individual culpability. The California state legislature, in the early 1850s, passed laws that allowed Native people to be bound to labor contracts without their meaningful consent, a system of indenture that was perilously close to the slavery the state constitution had prohibited for other populations. The state also paid directly for the killing of Native people. Bounty systems operating at the county level and sometimes with state reimbursement paid for the scalps or heads of Native men, women, and children. Militia units organized specifically for the purpose of killing Native Californians received state funding. The governor's annual messages to the legislature in the early 1850s contain language about the Native situation that is difficult to read today without recognizing it as describing what would now be called ethnic cleansing. Scholars who have studied the demographic records estimate that the native population of California fell from somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 in 1848 to roughly 30,000 by 1870. The causes were multiple, including disease, disruption of food sources, and the breakdown of social structures. But a significant portion of the deaths were the result of deliberate killing by settlers, miners, and state-sanctioned militias.
That history was not hidden at the time. It was reported and discussed. Some observers condemned it. But the people with the power to stop it were more interested in California's gold and California's potential than in the welfare of the people who had been living there since time beyond memory. The gold rush made California. The price of that making was paid most heavily by people who had nothing to do with gold. There were men who came to the gold rush from Latin America, and their experience in California was shaped both by their proximity and by the racism of Anglo-American miners. Chilean miners, Peruvian miners, and miners from Sonora in Mexico had geographic advantages. Chile and Peru were reachable by sailing ships that were already familiar with Pacific routes, and the journey to California from Valparaiso or Callao took weeks rather than months. Mexican miners from Sonora, which was the closest established mining region to California, could walk across the desert. These men arrived early, in many cases before most of the Anglo 49ers. They often had real mining experience. Sonoran miners in particular knew techniques for working gold-bearing ground that the American newcomers lacked. They were good at it, and they found gold. And then the American miners, who were arriving in much larger numbers through 1849, decided that California's gold was for Americans and took steps to enforce that opinion. The foreign miners' tax of 1850 was aimed directly at these Latin American miners, though it was applied to Chinese and other non-Anglo workers as well. In practice, it was collected selectively and enforced with violence. Groups of Anglo miners organized to drive foreign-born miners off their claims, using threats and physical force. The same justice that protected Anglo miners from claim jumping was explicitly withheld from Latin American miners who had their claims taken. Many of the Mexican and Chilean miners left California. Some went back home. Some went to Nevada when silver was discovered there. Some stayed and found ways to survive in the margins of the economy that was developing, working for wages on the claims that had been taken from them or in the supply trades around the camps. The Sonorans who came north in 1848 and early 1849 included men who'd been mining in Sonora for generations and who understood the work far better than the Argonauts who arrived later. They were pushed out by men who knew less about mining, but who had numbers and legal protection on their side. California lost significant mining expertise in the process, though the Anglo miners wouldn't have admitted or perhaps recognized that. Joaquin Murrieta, if he existed as the legend describes him, was a Sonoran who came to California with high hopes and was robbed and brutalized by Anglo miners until he turned outlaw. His legend, which may incorporate the stories of several different men into one composite figure, became a symbol for Mexican and Latino Californians of the injustice of the gold rush era. Whether the historical Murrieta was exactly as portrayed or not, the story it tells about what happened to Latino miners in California contains enough truth to have persisted. The gold rush produced an extraordinary amount of written material, and some of it is among the best primary source documentation we have for any event in 19th century American history. Men who'd never written more than letters home suddenly found themselves in circumstances so unprecedented that they felt compelled to record them. Trail diaries from the overland crossings survive in the hundreds, kept by farmers and lawyers and mechanics who never published anything before or after, but who understood that what they were experiencing was worth writing down. The quality of observation in those diaries is often remarkable. Men who had no formal training as writers were trying to describe landscapes and events that had no precedent in their experience, and the effort to find language adequate to what they were seeing produced writing that is vivid and specific in ways that more polished accounts sometimes aren't. William Perkins arrived in Sonora in 1849 and kept a journal for 3 years that was eventually published under the title 3 Years in California. Perkins was more literate than average and had a reporter's eye for detail, and his account of daily life in the mining town of Sonora is one of the best we have of the social dynamics of those places. He wrote about the gambling and the violence, but also about the cosmopolitan quality of the town, the mix of languages and customs, the impromptu civic institutions that formed when the need for them became clear. Daniel Woods, a Philadelphia minister who went to California in 1849, hoping to improve his family's financial situation, kept a diary that was published as 16 months at the gold diggings in 1851. Woods was a thoughtful observer who tried to understand what he was seeing in moral as well as economic terms, and his account has a reflective quality that complements the more purely descriptive accounts of other diarists. Sarah Royce, whose memoir My Pilgrim Journey was edited and published by her son Josiah Royce, the philosopher, described her family's overland crossing in 1849 with a combination of spiritual intensity and practical detail that is uniquely hers. She was crossing the same ground as thousands of other emigrants, but she saw it differently. And the memoir she wrote from her diaries and memory gives us a woman's experience of the journey that is rare in the record. These writers, and dozens of others like them, left a record of the gold rush that is simultaneously particular and representative. Each of them experienced something different, saw different things, thought about what they saw in different ways. Together they give us a picture of the gold rush that is more complex and more human than any summary account can convey. The picture they give us includes the gold and the excitement, the hope and the hardship. But it also includes the quiet moments. The evenings by the fire when the work was done. The view from a ridge in the Sierra Nevada in October when the aspens had turned yellow and the sky was that particular shade of blue that California gets in autumn. The moment of finding something in the pan that made your heart beat faster. The moment of finding nothing again and deciding to try the next spot. Those moments, the small ones, are what the gold rush was for the people who lived it. Not the grand narrative, the daily accumulation of experience, good and bad, that added up to a life. There's something worth saying about the 49ers who went home, because their return is a chapter that rarely gets told. Most of them arrived back in their home states changed in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes not. Some had money, a modest amount usually, more than they'd left with, sometimes significantly more. Some came back with nothing, or less than nothing, with debts still unpaid from what they'd borrowed to fund the journey. And all of them, the successful and the not, carried California with them in ways that shaped the rest of their lives. The ones who'd seen the Sierra Nevada and the Pacific and the immensity of the western landscape, who'd traveled farther from home than any of their ancestors had traveled, couldn't quite unsee it. The world they returned to was the same world they'd left, with the same limitations and the same rhythms, but they looked at it differently now. Some found that difference enriching, a new perspective on a familiar place. Some found it isolating. The man who'd spent 2 years in the Sierra Nevada foothills had a hard time explaining to his neighbors exactly what that had been like, and after a while stopped trying. Some of them wrote about it, which is how we know what they thought. More never wrote a word but talked about it, at family dinners and in barbershops and at church socials for the rest of their lives. The Gold Rush stories became family mythology, passed down through generations in ways that preserved some of the truth and transformed the rest into something more manageable, more heroic, more amenable to the needs of family legend.
By the 1870s and 1880s, California itself was becoming a place that Easterners thought about as the Golden State, the land of sunshine and possibility, which was not entirely wrong, but was a simplified image that had been shaped partly by the Gold Rush mythology and partly by the interests of the railroads and land developers who wanted to attract settlers. The 49ers, aging now, were figures in the founding story of that image. Their experience had been the raw material from which something more polished and more useful had been constructed. They didn't all agree with the polished version. The men who'd seen what the gold rush actually was, who'd lived through the floods and the cholera and the failed claims and the violence, sometimes found the romanticized accounts in the press and the dime novels faintly insulting. That wasn't what it was like, but the truth is always harder to tell than the story. The gold rush ended, officially and informally, in the late 1850s. The census figures for California show the population continuing to grow, but the character of the growth changed. The men who were coming now were coming to farm, to trade, to build businesses, to settle. They were coming for California itself, not for the idea that California's rivers might make them instantly wealthy. That shift marked something real. The gold rush, for all its chaos and injustice and failure, had done what it set out to do at the national level. It had populated California. It had given the United States a Pacific presence that would prove enormously important in the decades to come. It had created the conditions for a state that would, within a century, become the largest economy in the United States and one of the largest in the world. None of that was visible in 1849 from the perspective of a man kneeling in a cold river with a pan full of gravel. It was all in the future, and the future was uncertain, which is why the present was so absorbing and so frightening. The men who knelt in those rivers and swirled the water and watched what settled to the bottom were doing something very ordinary by human standards. They were trying to improve their circumstances, trying to give their families something better, trying to make use of an opportunity that might not come again. That's not heroic in any grand sense, it's just human. The heroism, if there is any, is in the persistence, in getting up the next morning and going back to the river even when the previous day hadn't produced much, in not giving up when the reality turned out to be harder than the dream had promised, in finding a way to keep going in conditions that tested everything. The gold is still there in California's hills, not in the rivers where the placer miners worked it out mostly, but in the quartz veins, deep in the rock, where it's been since the Sierra Nevada was formed. 300 million years of waiting. 175 years since anyone knew it was there. Patient and permanent and unchanged. The mountains have already outlasted the gold rush. The rivers have already recovered their clarity, mostly. The towns that were built in a season have been rebuilt and rebuilt again over generations. What persists is not the gold itself, which was taken away and turned into coins and jewelry and ornaments and eventually into the reserves of banks. What persists is the change, the reshaping of a state and of a national mythology and of the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who were somewhere else in 1847 and somewhere entirely different in 1850. That change is irreversible. California is what it is partly because of those years, those rivers, those men with their pans and their hopes. The gold rush happened. The world adjusted to accommodate it, slowly and imperfectly, and at great cost to many, and then moved on. And on cold January mornings in the Sierra Nevada foothills, when the light is right and the river is running clear over gravel that hasn't been touched in a long time, you can still look into the water and see something catch the light, something pale and heavy that settles to the bottom while everything else washes away. It doesn't break when you bite it. It never did.
And that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed. Can you please click like and subscribe? Thank you. God bless you. Bye.